So we're continuing with Unit 4. We have talked about soil and all of its importance. And so now we're going to move on to the atmosphere. So let's go ahead and jump right in to our PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, so first, let's just talk about what the structure is of the Earth's atmosphere. And before we talk about that, let's talk about the four parts of the Earth. Today, obviously, we're going to be focusing on the atmosphere, which is the air. The other three parts are the hydrosphere, which is the water, the geosphere, which is what we spent the last couple of days talking about, the rock, the soil, and the sediment. And then the last part, of course, is the biosphere, which is the living things. So, why is the atmosphere so important? Well, it's what provides us with the oxygen that we need to breathe, the carbon dioxide that plants need to survive. It absorbs most of the solar radiation that comes to our planet, keeps us at the right temperature by moderating the climate. And of course, it's also responsible for transporting and recycling water through the water cycle, and it is an important component of two of the nutrient cycles. So let's talk about this term atmospheric pressure. When we talk about atmospheric pressure, we're talking about the pressure that's caused by the weight of all of the air above us. We essentially live at the bottom of an ocean of air. Instead of being surrounded by water or pressed down on by water, we're being pressed down on by air. And you might remember from chemistry that a pressure is a force exerted over an area. And so atmospheric pressure is just the force or the weight of the air above us pressing down on us, exerting that force on us. So this means, of course, that the higher we are in the atmosphere, the smaller that column becomes. And therefore, as we go up through the atmosphere, as we go up into higher and higher altitudes, that pressure is going to decrease. Okay, so let's talk about what the atmosphere is made up of. Eventually we'll get there. There we go. Our atmosphere is largely nitrogen, 78% nitrogen, and about 20% oxygen, almost 21% oxygen. So those are the vast majority of the gases in the atmosphere. There are what we call trace gases. Argon is an important one, almost 1%. Tiny, tiny fractions of neon, helium, krypton, and hydrogen. So again, the number one gas in the atmosphere is nitrogen, which we remember is N2, and oxygen, which we also remember is O2. But there are some gases in the atmosphere whose concentration varies. Water vapor is certainly one of them. As temperature changes, it varies between 0 and 4%. Carbon dioxide is another one. 0.035%. We generally talk about that in parts per million because it's an easier number to wrap our heads around, as well as methane and ozone. And these four we talk about because they're really important to our climate, particularly carbon dioxide, methane, and ozone, because ozone is the gas that protects us from UV radiation from the sun. Carbon dioxide and methane are both powerful greenhouse gases. And of course, water vapor is important to us because it is a greenhouse gas and because it is incredibly important to life. So those are the gases that are in the atmosphere. Let's talk about how the Earth's atmosphere varies as we go up. We saw this little graph before. As we go up, Earth's air pressure decreases. But we also have a way to talk about layers of the Earth's atmosphere. And we arrange those layers according to temperature. As we go up through the atmosphere, temperature changes with altitude. And there's a lot of different reasons, and we're going to delve into those reasons. So we talk about the layers and we talk about the pauses. So down here where we live in the troposphere. The troposphere is where most weather happens. It is the region that we generally exist in, even in plains. We're well within the troposphere. So the troposphere is warmest near the surface. And as we go up through the troposphere, the air becomes thinner, the molecules get farther apart, and it starts to cool. And so temperature goes down as we go up through the troposphere towards the tropopause. During those pauses, temperature is relatively constant, and so that's what we use to define the difference between the different layers of the atmosphere. Above the troposphere, we have the stratosphere. And the stratosphere, it starts to get warmer again. So as we approach the stratopause, it gets warmer. The ozone layer is in the stratosphere, and the formation of that ozone layer helps to trap heat. And so the stratosphere gets warmer again as we approach stratopause. Moving up through the mesosphere, air is starting to get thinner again, and so it starts to get cooler again as we approach the mesopause. And then above mesopause in the thermosphere, it gets warmer again. Even though the molecules are incredibly spread out and it will feel cold, each of the molecules is incredibly warm because we are so very close to the exosphere, so very close to outer space. And so there's a lot of radiation that's being received in this zone. And so it's very warm. So, oops, we just talked about this. Air becomes thinner, molecules are farther apart. Okay, so that's our atmosphere. It's important that you know these four layers: tropopause, stratopause, troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, thermosphere, and outside the thermosphere is what we call the exosphere, which is either the farthest out layer of our atmosphere or beyond our atmosphere, depending on how you define it. So you should definitely know those four layers and know the order of them. So there's a little mnemonic device for remembering them, and that is thou shalt memorize this early for troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, thermosphere, exosphere. Okay, so now we understand the atmosphere. Let's talk about what's happening to the air inside that atmosphere. So we're going to talk about these global wind patterns. So there are four things that really determine these circulation patterns. Number one is air density. So warmer air is less dense than cold air. It has more particles in the same space. And so it rises. Just like anything in water that is less dense than water is going to float, that warmer air is going to float up above any colder air. Another thing that determines air circulation patterns is water vapor capacity. We know that warm air has a higher water vapor capacity. Just think about summers here in Tidewater. You know that it can be very, very humid on a hot day. That saturation point varies with temperature. So 90% humidity on a day when it is 90 degrees is very different from 90% humidity on a day when it's 40 degrees, because at 90%, that humidity, even though it's the same relative humidity, is much higher. There's much more water in the air. Okay, another major contributor to air circulation is what we call adiabatic heating and cooling. So as air rises and atmospheric pressure decreases, the volume of the air expands. And if you think back to the gas laws that you learned in chemistry, you know that as volume expands, that temperature is going to decrease. And so that air is going to cool. So as air rises and pressure is lowered, the volume is going to increase and the temperature is going to decrease. So simply by rising through the atmosphere, air is going to cool and the volume is going to expand. And then the last piece is what we call latent heat release. And so latent heat release and adiabatic heating and cooling are kind of flip sides of the same coin. So as that air cools, water vapor is going to condense because that saturation point is going to decrease and water vapor is going to condense into precipitation. When it does that, that process, you guys should remember, is an exothermic process. It's going to give off energy. Condensation and freezing always give off energy. And so that process of condensation is actually going to warm the air around it. So how do these all get put together? So as air moves towards low pressure areas, it's going to pick up moisture, it's going to pick up heat, it's going to get warmed by the sun, and that's going to cause it to rise as hot, wet air. As it rises, it's going to expand, it's going to cool, and that means that it is going to condense, and we're going to have precipitation in that area. As it condenses, because it's now high in the atmosphere, that heat is going to be released. That heat is going to radiate out into space. Now we have cool, dry air, and that's going to fall. As it falls through the atmosphere, it's going to get condensed. That's going to cause it to warm up, and we're going to have warm, dry air in areas of high pressure. So we get a cycle. And this cycle is what's responsible for the very rainy atmosphere near the equator, because we have that hot, wet air that's rising and then dropping its precipitation in that area. But then because of these global winds that we're going to talk about, it gets pushed away from the equator. As it cools and dries, it's going to fall, and it's going to fall as warm, dry air. And this is what's responsible for those desert biomes at 30 degrees north and south of the equator. So it's all starting to come together now. So let's talk about these cells. Okay. Near the equator, we have the most direct sun. So it's going to be the highest solar energy input. So that's going to make our air warm because generally near the equator, there's a lot of water. It's also going to be moist. It's going to rise and it's going to move towards the poles. As it moves towards the poles, it's going to cool and it's going to descend. And that's that 30 degrees north and south of the equator. And we call that cell the Hadley cell. Okay, above that, we have another cell, these cells here, where air is rising and falling again at that 30 degree. And this is what we call the Hadley cell. And up here, these cells up near the poles, these cells are the ones that are driving the Hadley cells. So we're going to come back, the Ferrel cells. So we're going to come back to the Ferrel cells. These polar cells are being driven by air rising here. It's warmer at 60 than it is at the poles. And so this warmer air is rising, again, cooling and drying and falling at the poles and then cycling back. So this is the polar cell. The movement of the polar cells and the Hadley cells is what drives these Ferrel cells. And so these two outside of it are kind of forcing this one in the center. It is important that you know the cells. Again, there's a mnemonic for that. So as we move from the poles to the equator, it gets pretty friggin' hot. And so you can remember polar, Ferrel, and Hadley. These zones where the cells interact are areas with very little wind. So this intertropical convergence zone, what's known as the horse latitudes or the doldrums here with the intertropical convergence zone. But these cells drive the trade winds on our planet. And those trade winds are incredibly important because they deliver weather to the different areas of the planet. And so they're really in large part responsible for these biomes. So again, that descent of the dry air is the reason that we have these desert zones at 30 degrees north and south of the equator. Um, they're also the reason for much of our Mediterranean weather, and certainly for our polar weather. All right, one more thing to talk about before we finish talking about global winds, and that's the idea of what's called the Coriolis effect. In this previous slide, you guys saw that we talked about the cells, but you also see these little arrows that are representing the direction of the winds. And you notice that the winds don't go straight towards the equator or straight away from the equator, but actually have this curve to them. And you notice that above the equator, they curve in one direction, and below the equator, they curve in the opposite direction. So what's the reason for that? And the reason for that is something that we call the Coriolis effect. And the Coriolis effect tells us that objects moving in a straight line, if you are rotating, are going to appear to curve. And this has an effect on winds because the surface of the Earth at the equator is traveling much faster than it is at the poles. So if you think about the fact that the Earth is spinning at a particular rate, revolving at a particular rate, and you know that the circumference of the Earth is much smaller up near the poles than it is at the equator, and yet the whole globe has to be spinning at the same rate. This means that the surface of the Earth at the equator is moving much faster. So air at the equator is also moving at that same speed. And as that air gets pushed away from the equator or towards the equator, it's going to maintain its same wind speed, and it's going to appear to curve off to one side or the other. And this is what causes those global trade winds. So let's take a look at these global trade winds. So again, their direction north-south is being driven by those cells, but the direction east-west is being driven by the Coriolis effect. And so you'll notice that here above the equator in that Hadley cell, it's being driven down and to the southwest. Below the equator, it's being driven up and to the northwest. And so these regions of global trade winds are driven by the Coriolis effect and by those cells. One last thing when we talk about climate is solar radiation and the Earth's seasons. So what causes, before we get to what causes seasons, we got to talk about how the Earth moves, sorry. So we know certainly that the Earth moves in two ways. It actually moves in three. The two that you recognize, rotation and revolution. The third way that the Earth moves is called equinoctial precession, and it refers to the rotation of the Earth's axis. The angle of the tilt remains the same, but there's a wobble. As far as climate, that equinoctial precession is not significant. The two that really matter are rotation and revolution. So why do rotation and revolution matter? Well, we know that rotation is what takes us around the, is what's responsible for our day. Revolution takes us around the sun. So these affect the amount of solar energy at the surface of the Earth, which corresponds to plant productivity. Okay, so what causes our seasons? We have summer when, for us in the Northern Hemisphere, our planet is tilted toward the sun. The sun rises higher, it stays above the horizon longer, and most importantly, the rays strike the ground most directly at less of an angle. When it strikes the ground at more of an angle, it loses some of its energy. Please, please, please understand, seasons are not caused by Earth's distance from the sun. We here in the Northern Hemisphere are actually closer to the sun in the winter. Okay, so the responsibility for seasons falls on the tilt of the planet. Whichever side of the planet, northern or southern hemisphere, is tilted towards the sun is going to be having summer. Whichever side is tilted more away from the sun is going to be having winter. So here, living in the northern hemisphere, when we are tilted away from the planet, away from the sun, we're going to have our shortest days. We're going to have the least solar energy, and we're going to therefore have the coldest temperatures and the least activity from photosynthesizers. In the summer, when we are tilted most toward the sun, then we are going to have the longest days and the most solar energy. And this tilt away and toward the sun really comes back to here when we're tilted away from the sun, when we're on the opposite side of our revolution around the sun, we're tilted toward the sun. Okay, so let's talk weather and climate. Weather is short-term atmospheric conditions. It's what we feel in a particular area. Weather is turning on the television to find out what the temperature is going to be today, whether or not it's going to rain. Okay, so that's weather. Climate, on the other hand, is the general pattern of weather conditions measured over long periods of time. So it's an average. Weather and climate are not the same thing. Climate is the overall average of weather over extended periods of time. Weather is short term. What's happening today? What's happening tomorrow? So, climate's what we expect. Weather is what we get. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll see you soon.